Welcome. I'm your host, Mark Graziano, and this is the GRC Podcast. This is your source for discussions about governance, risk, compliance, and more. I partner with incredible security champions to challenge the GRC industry stereotype and to outline security career and program strategies that you can implement today. Joining me today is Dustin Bailey. Dustin is a former colleague of mine, and he's the former security lead at Twilio Segment. I really wanted Dustin to be one of the first people that I interviewed for this podcast because he's one of the first people who actually challenged my opinions of how GRC should be practiced. Dustin is phenomenal at being able to ruthlessly prioritize, really zero in on what aspects of a GRC program produce the most value for a company or reduce the most risk, while also taking into account the different limitations that they might be experiencing, whether it's headcount or time. And he's also a phenomenal business partner. One of the things that I think that I've seen as a GRC failure is that it becomes this isolated function. And Dustin did a great job working with everybody across the business, understanding the product, understanding the business, understanding the different cultures of the people that he was working with to make sure he solicited the feedback. So by the time he had to implement security controls, they had already been socialized, and the people that were most impacted by them had a hand in actually designing them. The lessons Dustin was able to share with me have made me a better security practitioner, and I think the lessons that he's learned deserve to be told to a broader audience as well. So in this interview, I'm really excited. I hope you all see why Dustin has made such an impact on me personally and professionally. So Dustin, welcome to the GRC Podcast. Thanks for joining us. As I mentioned in the introduction, you are the former security lead for Twilio Segment. You've since moved on, so I'm happy to have dragged you back into the GRC space.
Well, thanks, Mark. I'm happy to be with you. This is exciting. Excited for you to be doing a GRC podcast. I think this and maybe a different take on things. I think this is a nice, fresh approach to GRC. I love it.
So we're about 2 sentences in, and I'm already crushing it as a host. I wasn't expecting a compliment about me doing a GRC podcast, but what I should have told Dustin was, thank you for opening my eyes to some of the things that I was doing wrong and for making me a better professional and for inspiring me enough to work on this outside of my 9-to-5. But instead, I went with this. Yeah, and usually I would have you state kind of just like your general background so everybody could understand what the authority figure that you are is. But I think in this case, that's going to be the entirety of the episode. So if we could just kind of start just right away. Why GRC? How did you choose GRC? How did you get into this space?
Man, GRC chose me, I suppose. I honestly had no idea that this space existed. I didn't know it was a thing. It was, I guess, my junior year of college at the University of Tennessee. And I ended up it was an information management class, which was like, it was a thing that every business major had to take. And it was like access databases. And I have a somewhat technical background. I'd done IT stuff all through high school and everything. And so the class was a breeze for me and it was tough for everyone else. And it just so happened that the TA that was teaching that class, she was a accounting graduate student and had spent the previous summer interning at Deloitte in Deloitte's audit practice, but specifically what they called advisory or enterprise risk services, which was doing the IT side of SOX audits. And I really didn't know that it existed. To be quite honest with you, as a finance major, I knew I'd heard of Deloitte before, but it was kind of like, oh, what's this thing? Like the Big Four didn't really mean as much to me as my accounting counterparts. But she came to me and was like, hey, you're really good at this stuff. I think you'd be good for like what we do at Deloitte. Would you be interested in like talking to some people about it? And I'm like, yeah, sure thing. And so one thing led to another, and I ended up interviewing and ended up interning with Deloitte in the summer between my junior and senior years of college, and got a full-time offer at the end of that. So spent my senior year knowing that I was going to go work for Deloitte, and that's what kind of got me into it. So I graduated next year, graduated May, went to work in September, and started doing the IT side of SOX audits, so testing mainly what we called the GCCs, the General Computer Controls. This feels like a throwback to say, or general IT controls, things like that. So it was a lot of IT controls testing. And so it was a pretty good marriage of like my business education, but then my IT background. I understood a lot more of the technical aspects of what we were doing than a lot of folks who may have been pure accounting majors or had never had experience to this. And so that kind of gave me an edge. I was able to sit down in meetings with clients and understand the environment a lot faster, especially Active Directory. I'd been involved with managing I had helped the school system. I'd worked for the school system here in my hometown for 5 summers. And so it was an Active Directory based thing. I was kind of involved. It was mostly help desk type stuff, but we also did some things on the more technical side and the configuration side, working with servers. So I was already familiar with a lot of that stuff, the terminology. I was able to sit down with like system admins and have a intelligent conversation with them right off the bat. And a lot of the folks that were in my same start class at Deloitte couldn't. They were still really trying to learn the technical side to it. And so that's what got me into it. I started learning that there's this whole area of governance, risk, and compliance, and so that was I can kind of go in my career from there. But that's what ultimately got me into it. It was a space that I had no idea existed until someone reached out and said, "Hey, I think you'd be good for this." So very thankful to have had that opportunity, because otherwise I'd have no idea what I would have done for the last 10 years.
Now, I think that's like a similar start to kind of what I had. And I feel like it's the similar start to a lot of people where they get out of college and the consulting firms are always kind of looking for those like the tier one resources to kind of get their foot in the door. And GRC is like an interesting space to start that. You did mention that you did have that technical background. Did you feel like the majority of the people that you worked with came from the same technical side, or was not so much?
Not at all.
Okay, now before we go any farther into this section, I don't want anybody to feel alienated. We're not doing any kind of gross gatekeepy thing where we're saying you have to have X technical degree or X technical background to be successful in this space. But at the same time, if you're tasked with doing an assessment of different systems, you got to know what systems you're assessing. You got to know the nuances of them. If I was to go off and do assessments of airline safety systems, it would be reasonable to expect of me that I understood what I was assessing, correct? I think that's a fair critique. So that's all that we're trying to say here.
In fact, it was to look back on it now, it's kind of scary to think about the people who are being asked to do these more technical audits, and kids just straight out of school, and most were clueless. And really, the clients could have put anything in front of them and said, "Hey, this is how it's supposed to be," and they didn't understand enough to know or question or. Yeah, so that kind of goes down a whole other topic of like lack of experience. But definitely, I was somewhat set apart in the fact that like I could actually understand things. Someone could put code in front of me and I could understand. Like I took a Visual Basic class, VB6 in high school, and so like I understood the very basics of programming. Someone could put code in front of me and walk me through it, and I could actually understand it. And so I was able to ask very intelligent questions of clients and kind of try to poke some holes in things and make sure that I understood it and that I was documenting it and that I just wasn't, taking the client's word for, "Hey, this is how it's supposed to be." And then I had a lot of colleagues that were just like, "Okay, that sounds good," and would just write it up, whatever the client said. And they really had no idea what they were looking at. So that was, I guess, in some ways good and bad. It made me take longer in my work because I actually was like asking proper questions, whereas I think everybody else was just kind of going through the motions. So there was a little bit of a balance there, but definitely even folks who had come from like management information systems backgrounds, which Tennessee did not have a program in that, which is, if they did, that's probably what I would have done. Even folks with more MIS backgrounds, which should have had the more technical experience, I really wasn't seeing a lot of it. It was a lot of folks with mostly accounting backgrounds who were kind of like, "Oh, hey, this sounds somewhat different than the straight up financial statement audit and tax stuff that I've been doing in school. I want to explore this." And then they could test controls. They understood like how to figure things out and how to evaluate if a control was working, but then they also didn't fully understand the underlying tech. So in some ways, how can you evaluate if control's working if you don't understand the tech? I think that's a fair question.
And I think we've had a similar experience there. Because like I worked with some people where somebody lateraled from like, I did whale watching up in Cape Cod and now I'm doing like GRC, or I was a trombone major and now I'm doing GRC. So I think that working with those types of individuals, being in the GRC space, you having some type of technical background to kind of help you with those technical questions for customers. How did that shape your opinion of like what GRC was and kind of what your goals for the future would be?
Yeah, I mean, early on, I didn't know. I would say it took me, I don't know, 3 to 4 years into my career before I actually, when I had left Deloitte and was doing some other stuff, I remember coming across things. And I was like, "Oh, that's what that meant." And I was like, "Well, I wish I would have known that when I was like supposed to be doing that as my job." So I think it was kind of like this growth thing as I got exposed to more companies and more ways of doing things. I think, Big Four, I didn't have. I had 2 or 3 main clients that I spent 75% of my time on, and then I would have some smaller clients. And I stayed at Deloitte for about 2 years. We just lost power.
Now, just for some context, the night before, Tennessee had about 5 tornadoes that came through the state. And then the following day, there were high wind advisories all across the state. Dustin lost power. I didn't realize that it was a full power loss. I thought it was just like we lost power, it blipped, we're back on. But you can kind of hear me slowly realize what's going on and trying to figure out if I need to cancel this interview, if I need to reschedule. And then I kind of realized that, hey, this is kind of the reason why I wanted to start this podcast in the first place, is these lessons that we have in GRC are really, really practical in pretty much every single aspect of either your professional life or your personal life. So having this happen was weirdly serendipitous. Give me a sec. Let me check my internet.
No, it was me. We lost power.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Just you guys still have high winds there?
Yeah, it's been super windy here today, and it's flickered a couple of times, but it's now just like properly gone out. But I have a UPS on my modem.
I was going to say, how are we still talking?
So
here?
That's how we're still talking.
Well, that adds a little bit of creativity to how we're going to be doing this. So, I mean, we don't need the video. So I'm impressed you got the UPS there.
I don't know how long it'll last. So we'll have to.
I was going to say, have you done like disaster recovery testing for this? This is a good segue, Mickey. How have you used GRC in your personal life?
Oh man, yeah, exactly. Like, so interestingly enough, I do have a UPS that I've had a UPS for a long time, ever since I got exposed to this space. And it's keeping my modem, and right now it's just plugged into my router and my cable.
You're running off a laptop battery?
Yeah.
Now at this point, I start rambling a little bit about prepping. Dustin talks about the Tesla Powerwall. We start talking about the pluses and minuses for whole home generation, whether you're using diesel or natural gas. So I think we can just skip right to the point of the conversation where things start to feel a little bit more structured when we realize we still have content that we can still talk about, and this can still be a salvageable interview.
I've always kind of had a natural, the question about applying GRC to like everyday life. I've always been this, like, I tend to ask the question of, okay, well, what could go wrong here? And so from like the risk management side of GRC, I felt like I've been pretty decent at that, because I could ask that question and then turn around and say, okay, well, let's list out what could go wrong. And then of course there's, you start doing what's the likelihood, what's the impact, things like that. You're doing effectively a risk assessment. And so, I mean, I've definitely used that skill set in everyday life. I mean, exactly the whole reason we're still able to be talking right now is because I was like, well, I want at least my internet to stay up long enough that, like, if something were to happen, that for like Ring cameras and the Ring alarm and all that stuff, like other things there would still be able to maintain a connection to the internet for. And it's going to be interesting how long the power is actually out here, because I think this thing's only going to last about 20, 30 minutes. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I mean, it's literally like doing this evaluation of, okay, what it like in the event of a power outage, what do I want to keep up? Like what are the things I want to keep up? Where our house is kind of in a little bit of a gully, I suppose, and we don't get really good cell reception right here at the house. And so if we lose internet, that kind of like I would about have to leave the house and go somewhere else to be able to have it on my phone. So being able to keep internet up and running in the event of a power outage is important to me. And so, then it becomes the question, okay, well, how long do I want to keep it up, and what type of UPS do I need? And then there's the cost evaluation. So, I mean, there's a ton of parallels to like things that I've done in my GRC career, when it's like, okay, like you're having to make all these trade-offs about what's the actual risk, what is it we're trying to guard against, and then what's the cost of guarding against that, and where's the happy middle ground there.
Now I'm thinking of like customer calls that we've had, and like I even hopped on one yesterday where some of the expectations for like the type of data, the type of risks, like wanting like the disaster recovery that needed to be like just all the bells and whistles, and it's like taking into consideration like what exactly is it that we're protecting? What cost are you trying to impose on me? And is that cost, am I ever going to see any kind of return on investment, or is that ever going to come to fruition? And if it does come to fruition, if we do end up like losing data at a certain point, like what is the actual risk of that data loss versus the amount of money and effort and time we're all spending trying to protect that?
Exactly. Yep. And I mean, I've done that with other things. It's like for years I've been like, when I was in high school, I had a laptop and a hard drive went bad, and I lost basically everything that I had because I wasn't doing any backups. And after that happened, I was like, this is never happening to me again. And so I've been using like online backup services for 15 years now or something like that, like way before a lot of people were using them and having, physical backups and things that way. And, it comes in, then that's changed a lot. As stuff's moved to, a lot of cloud-based things where it's like it's no longer dependent on one machine, so I don't necessarily need to have a machine backed up. But it still comes down to this evaluation of I have to look at. I'm like, okay, what's the real risk here of me actually losing this data versus all the time I'm spending? Like, okay, I need to back this up. I need to back it up on this frequency. I want to, take this hard drive over to someone else's house so that if it's some separate location in case there's a fire at the house, like, and ultimately, I think as more things have gone to the cloud, I've really pulled that back, and I'm like, the risk, the risk is high, or like the impact would be high, but the likelihood of so many things like would have to fall into place in order for me to actually lose data, and it's like it's just not worth some of those additional steps. But I mean, that's exactly the conversation that we would have at Segment about, okay, like what, and customers would ask about certain sorts of things, and it's like, okay, well, yes, like there is a risk there, but the likelihood's super low, and we don't think we're going to need to do something. And I think about we had a very large customer that asked us in the fall of 2019. They're like, "Well, do you have a pandemic plan?" And we all just kind of looked at each other and we're like, "No, that's ridiculous." Like,
Oh, I
we don't have a
remember those
pandemic
questions.
plan.
It's like having to do the auditing. Do you guys have pandemic plans? Oh, yeah, sure, whatever. That's never going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we at Segment, the biggest like physical risk, we had was we thought there'd be would be an earthquake in San Francisco, right? I mean, that's a legitimate risk. But none of the office could get completely pummeled to the ground, and it really wouldn't impact customer processing because there wasn't anything that was hosted there. So that informed a lot of our risk things. It's taking a look at, okay, what could go wrong. Yes, the situation would be bad, but would it really have that big of an impact on like the core thing that we're trying to provide here? And so I think that decision making framework, it has a lot of applications in business and all sorts of different true GRC applications at work, but then applying it in your everyday life, like there's kind of limitless things there, and you end up going through that same sort of decision making tree and framework in a variety of situations.
And out of curiosity, because I think that's one of those things where when I went from consulting over to like actually being an internal resource doing GRC, do you think there is kind of a difference in terms of I'm going to call it more academia based GRC and kind of consulting? This is the best practice, but not taking into consideration any of like the cultural aspects of the company. What is the data that you're actually looking at? Because I think the conversations that we're having, like they make sense. It's very obvious. And then you kind of hop on the calls with either consultants or other GRC resources who have maybe just gone from consulting directly to internal, or they're just kind of operating on like the standard traditional way of looking at GRC. And it's almost we need the best thing for every single one of these controls. It needs to be the tippy top of the chain, regardless of what resources we need to make and put in front of it. Like that's the only acceptable answer.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a massive gap between the theory and the actual implementation. And I think I actually meant to look this up before we talked here, but there's a video of Steve Jobs talking at is in I think the early 90s, talking at MIT's Sloan School of Business to some class. And he basically said, "Hey, how many of you are going into consulting?" And half the class raised their hand, and he's like, "Well, I feel sorry for you." And he was, and I would encourage anybody to like go out and actually listen to that, because his point was there's a massive difference between going in and saying, as a consultant, and saying you need to be doing XYZ. Okay, here's my fancy PowerPoint that tells you that. Okay, pay us our fee. All right, we're gone. And then actually doing X, Y, and Z. And that's something to where like you can have all the pretty frameworks and the ideas and the picture perfect textbook way of how something should be implemented, but it's never going to be that way in the real world, because the real world's not the textbook, right? Like there's other constraints, there's other issues. You've got lack of resources, whether that's people or money or time or whatever. And I think that's very it's tough for people who have never been in the implementation side to understand that. And I think it can make, like, I think consulting is a great way to go straight out of school, because you can get a lot of experience in things. But I think the better consultants are the ones who have had time in industry and understand the constraints around implementation. And then that's able to inform how they tell clients to do something, because they now understand it's not just a matter of throwing something on some PowerPoint deck and being done with it, right? There's actual other considerations that go into implementing this thing. And there's trade-offs. Like there's never a perfect way. You can have this perfect model, but then you're not going to be able to implement 100% of that. So I think especially for younger people, just straight out of school who've never had any experience, or any experience implementing, they know the textbook way, and that's good. But it also is maybe less than half the story. Like knowing what to do and doing it are two completely different things. And so that being able to understand how to actually implement something, I think, is probably the higher value skill. And that's what, if you could go in and then, like, as a consultant, if you could be the one that's not just telling people what to do, but actually implement it, you're going to get paid a lot more doing that, because that's more valuable.
Now, how long did you stay in consulting?
I guess it depends on, well, I was in, I don't know, 5 years, I guess. I started at Deloitte in 2011, and then I went into industry, you could say, in 2016.
Okay. Out of curiosity, would you change it? Because like coming from like my perspective of like 7 years doing consulting work and then working with somebody like you, and I'm just like, oh my God, like some of the things that I said on interviews where I really thought I knew stuff and I really absolutely didn't. Like I feel like the 7 years, while I probably could have learned a lot more if I had transitioned to being an internal resource, almost like the impacts of like me not only like having that experience and being like it's been 7 years, but like maturing as an adult, having like the additional 7 years behind me. I think the lessons learned working for like you and Steve at Segment have almost like stuck with me a little bit more than they might have if I had just done consulting for like a year or two and then hopped into the industry. Would you change your 5 years, or would you go quicker into an internal resource role?
I don't know that I would have gone quicker. I don't think I would change a lot about it, because I think, and that's why I get the sentiment of what, like referencing the Steve Jobs video. I get that sentiment and I completely agree with it. But at the same time, that's not to say that consulting has no value. Because one of the biggest benefits, and this changed especially after I left Deloitte, and I started to mention this right as I think the power went out. I left Deloitte and was doing. I had 3 big clients at Deloitte. It was taking up 75% of my time. And so I was seeing a lot of those 3 clients and how they did things, but I wasn't getting a massive amount of exposure. I went to Brightline at the time, now Shellman, and I was on a new project every other week. And so, and from large companies to, small startups. And so that just really accelerated my learning, because I was in and out of all of these places and seeing how companies did things, and seeing the good and the bad. And in some cases, they're really, really ugly. And, getting a feel for what actually worked and what didn't. And so I think that was more valuable. Like that's what I wouldn't have changed, because it really gave me the perspective to understand there's multiple ways to do things, and how you do something can vary based on the situation. And for some things, there's not necessarily one right way. It all depends on a variety of factors. And so getting that experience, I wouldn't have traded that, because it got me exposure, not only just processes, but tools, like different software that's used to do different types of things. And that came in handy when in industry, when customers would come asking about, well, do you use XYZ software? And I might not have any idea what that does, but because I had seen another company do it and I knew how it was supposed to be implemented, I could break that down to the core of like, okay, they're asking about this software, but really what they're asking about is, are we doing this sort of process? And so it would allow me to be able to say, no, we don't use this piece of software, but we do the same thing that it does. Here's how we accomplish it. And so just having that wide variety of exposure to things, I think, was super valuable. And I would definitely encourage, if there's anyone that's just starting out, to go that same path, but also know that I think you are worth more in the implementer role, as opposed to just purely consulting forever. But I think there's a massive amount of value in consulting early on to get exposure to a wide variety of things.
And a couple of things that kind of makes me think about. So, like you mentioned, talking to customers. So that's definitely something that when I came over to Segment, I realized that was almost a major value proposition for having a specific GRC resource, is being able to kind of tell that story and be able to communicate to multiple stakeholders. Here's exactly what we're doing. And it's not just this specific control, it's the actual narrative. I think when you came to Segment, what were some of like the core, like most valuable things that you've like focused on? Like what should a GRC person working for an internal company like focus on first and foremost?
Oh man, that's a great question. I think in general in GRC, you need to be as close to the product slash sales as possible. And I think that's going to be true for anybody in any sort of business, because the further removed you are from that, the more likely your role is to get cut in bad times or restructuring, things like that. The closer that you can tie your worth to like what your job is and how that's helping to drive sales and helping grow the company, and especially if there's maybe not, sorry, my dog's barking here, if it's not directly tied to maybe sales, but it's tied to a very important strategic goal of the company, like that's what's important to really align yourself with. And that's something that when I came into Segment, Colleen, our CISO, she was very adamant about us being able to talk about what we did in terms of how it was moving the company forward. And that was a little bit of a change for me, because especially I had been at McKesson prior to that. And I mean, McKesson's a massive organization, and you get a lot of people that are pigeonholed and they think, okay, well, I make sure that all of the dates on the policies are updated as they should be, and that all the typos are fixed. And my job is very critically important to everything that goes on. And it's like, well, no, it's not. Like your job's not actually that job is not that important. And then you say, okay, well, how are you helping move the company forward? It's like, well, they don't know, they can't, and it's truly because I think there's in an instance like that, that's not a terribly valuable job. So you have to be able to like tie things into, again, strategic goals, to sales, to customers, to like the things that actually matter to the business side of the business. And I think that's again, a lot of folks who, especially if you come from the consulting side, that's never something you consider. It's not something that is generally evaluated as part of, you're blowing out of these clients. You're not taking a lot of time to understand their business. And so if you make that switch from consulting to GRC, you're not used to talking about all of the things that you talk about in terms of the business. And that's super important to be able to make the switch, is understand how is what I'm doing actually moving the business forward, and not some high level thing like, well, we help keep the company safe. It's like, okay, well, how, like, quantify that. Like, at Segment, we would try to tie things and say, well, we've supported, X million dollars of ARR. Like we have directly helped support either renewals or new sales because of, like, we implemented this feature that was being asked by this number of customers. And so therefore we can say that that's helped us drive a certain number of revenue. And so that was really how we justified almost everything that the security team did. Not that we would just go around implementing everything that customers asked for, but if we saw a large number of requests from, or the same type of request from a large number of customers, then we knew that was probably something we should go and build, and that would be important to the business. Not just because we felt like it was something that needed to be done for security, but like we could now directly tie this to a business outcome. So that was kind of a long-winded way of answering that question. But I think that's like thinking about your role in GRC in terms of the business and how it's moving the business forward is, I think, something a lot of folks don't realize. And I certainly didn't until I got to Segments. I mean, I spent 3 years at McKesson and never really could tell you how what I was doing was moving any of the business units that I worked with forward. And that was a mistake looking back.
Because, I think that was one of the things that I recognized that you guys were doing that I found impressive was actually, it's not proving the negative. Like, look, over the course of like X number of years, we haven't had any kind of breach and therefore we're valuable. Doesn't create the best business story to like earn budget, get additional headcount, really kind of demonstrate value to the company. And I think the other aspect of moving the business forward, aside from obviously the business growth and contributing to that in some certain way, is creating different products that other teams can actually use to reduce risk. And I think one of the things coming from consulting, going into internal, seeing what Segment was doing, I remember you guys pulled up a risk spreadsheet that you were sending out to different stakeholders. And instead of some like big NIST-based thing that's got like a lot of different formulas that you've programmed into a spreadsheet, it was literally a Google Doc form that had like skull and crossbone emojis talking about what's the impact, what's the likelihood of something happening. Can you kind of describe some of the other projects, or if you want to describe that particular one, just in terms of putting something that's simple that's in place. And just because it's simple doesn't mean it's not valuable, or complexity doesn't equate to more value to the business.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely something. The consultant mindset says, okay, well, they're paying $200 an hour for my time, so therefore I need to deliver a product that seems like it's worth paying $200 an hour for, and that ends up being these overly convoluted things. And I think it makes people feel good. They're like, well, look at this complicated thing that the consultants put together. But if it's never going to be used, or if it's difficult to use and you can't extract like actual value out of it, then was it worth paying for? Probably not. And I think the example you gave there is one of my favorites from Segment. When we we were just under kind of a time crunch. We needed to put out minimum viable product, and it's like, okay, we need to do a risk assessment. What's the easiest way that we can communicate, that we can first of all get this done, but then communicate risk in terms that engineers and other folks who aren't used to dealing with like the NIST risk terms and things like that, well, how can we put that in terms that they understand? And so it was like, okay, like 1 to 5 skull and crossbones. Like, what's, if this thing were to actually come to fruition, what's the risk to the company? Like, is this just a little, it's kind of inconvenience, or is like the company done? And it was like, it was really translating it into terms that, that I guess the stakeholders are really the subject matter experts, the folks who we really relied upon to accurately gauge these things, because they knew where, all the bodies were buried, and they knew all the problems with the systems and things like that. Like putting it into terms where they could very quickly give us a very valuable response. And then we could measure that over time. And that, again, I think is, you get a lot of people that, especially if they've come from a consulting background, they have their frameworks. They think, okay, this is how things have to be done. And then they show up in a meeting with one of those subject matter experts and say, okay, we need you to rate this 1 to 5. And it's a bunch of esoteric terms and NIST-based terms and things that folks have never understood, and they don't take the time to understand it. And then you end up with this like mutual frustration, because the GRC folks are upset that the engineers don't understand. And the engineers are like, why are you wasting my time? And it just doesn't foster a good relationship there. So being able to like put things into simple terms that others can understand, that you can quickly get valuable feedback, like that's why that exercise was so valuable to us. I mean, we ended up doing that, I think, over almost 2 years. I guess it was about quarterly we did that, and did it for 2 years, so about eight different iterations. And it just made things very easy to not only get information from the subject matter experts, but then to like communicate that information upward. We could communicate that to the E-team and say, okay, in terms of skull and crossbones, this is like, we think this is a really, like, we've talked to a lot of people, this is a very serious risk. And like, we believe we need to prioritize some resources to try to reduce this, or do something to make this not a 4 on the skull and crossbones scale. Let's see if we can get it down to a 2. And so putting it in those terms, it made the executives are like, okay, crap, like that's, yeah, you guys are right. Like we need to do something about this. So,
and that was a success story, right? You were able to basically list out, hey, here are our top 10 risks that we've defined based on the questionnaire that we sent our engineers. And over time, if I'm not mistaken, you guys were able to knock down like the top 3 risks and basically replace them with, all right, we've mitigated that. Here are our new top 3.
Yeah, absolutely. And things would shift. And that was one of the fun things. Oh, hey, the power's coming back on.
Nice.
We'll get video back here.
Oh, I'm completely keeping all of this in there, because this really speaks to kind of the core, like what this podcast is supposed to be about.
If we need to go back and re-record some of this,
did you do that intentionally? You can be honest.
Yeah, exactly. No, team me up for that question again.
Yeah. So what was? I'm trying to think of like what the question was.
I remember. Yeah, we were able to knock down some of the top risks. And then the thing that would happen is we would see risks that we had previously thought were very important, that the more that time went on, we realized that they weren't. And some of this was just us, like there really wasn't a formal risk program of this, especially of this caliber, where it could produce valuable results at Segment. And so we were standing up something from new. And so in some ways, we initially, in the initial versions of it, we would call out things that we thought were risks. But then as time would go on, we'd realize, those things aren't that important. There's these other things that we hadn't thought about that's more important. So sometimes things would drop off the list because we just realized we have to prioritize 10, and this thing that we previously thought was important is not as important as something else we've since realized, or some other new situation that's come up. So it was very fluid. And I think that's good, right? Like you get people who will do risk assessments, and it's just like, Sally, right? Same as last year. It's changed the date. Like, okay, yeah, well, this risk, yeah, it's still, and it's just a bunch of high level risks that everyone can kind of sit around and say, well, yeah, that's still there and it's probably still the same. And you look at a risk assessment across like 5 years and it's basically identical except for the dates. And like that's not helping anybody. And so the fact that like this was a very real, like living, breathing document that we were making like not only security team goal decisions on, but like it was informing executive decisions about how to focus engineering resources. And that it would change and it would move around. It was I think that's exactly how this is supposed to be. And yet I don't know that I've ever seen another organization that has done it that way. It's so often just ends up being this check the box exercise that GRC does, and then they just kind of move on. But we
I
had a
mean, even
very
assessing
living.
it when I was doing consulting, like that was kind of the expectation. Like even if you had like the same customer be like, "Yep, I recognize those risks. Yep, it's a
Yep.
new year. There you go. We saw that."
And that was a challenge too, starting to present this to auditors and to customers when they almost look at it and they're like, well, this can't be real. Like you're not taking this, you got skull and crossbones here. Like this isn't serious. And so that, we had a bit of a education hurdle in sharing with others outside, like, no,
Oh, did
this
you
is
actually
real.
share it with? Because like when
We
I saw it, it was one of those where like I wasn't off put by it. I was almost kind of like, this makes more sense than somebody trying to BS some type of like Monte Carlo thing where like
Yeah.
they've kind of gone and like put numbers to things, but those numbers were assigned based on a feeling. So now you have like a quantified, like qualitative risk that
Yep.
really doesn't provide any kind of value.
Yep. And that like that to me is one of the big I think value, or that was the big value was that so many people could understand it, but the problem was that the GRC folks and others who were trained, the more classically trained people, would see it and they didn't know what to do with it because it did not look like the thing they expected it to look like. Because everyone's like, oh, I know that this check the box exercise, it's going to be some sort of spreadsheet that's got the fairly standard tabs and the rows and the columns, and you got the
Just
risk ranking, and there's some
emojis.
sort of
What is
calculation.
this?
Yeah, and there's like they're seeing this Google form with emojis in it, and they're like, well, this can't be real. Like, where's your actual risk assessment? Like, I can remember we had a customer ask us that, like, well, this is nice, but can we see your formal risk assessment? And we're like, this is it. And so the benefit that we had there is we could map things from here's where this was evaluated, decisions were made, and then we could show that it was informing like business wide roadmaps for what to build. And that's what lent it a lot of credibility. But unfortunately, because it didn't look like the thing that so many people expected it to look like, literally wouldn't believe that it was real or it was the right thing until we showed no, like it's like the E team is making decisions based on this document and this process.
Yeah, and actually thinking about like mental hurdles and working with other stakeholders in terms that they can understand. I think we can do the flip side of that is you working with stakeholders to put the control that you want to put in place, kind of getting them to define well what it is that you would do. Have you ever had any kind of control that you've had to work with stakeholders, not just to enforce this is what I think we need to be doing with respect to this particular control, but really getting their feedback to help you design it?
Yeah, I think that our change control process was probably the biggest example. We had plenty, and there was certainly plenty with trying to talk through customers where they would want to know, well, where's your control around this? And we would have to say, well, we don't do that, but we address this risk, the underlying risk, like they were equating control and risk, and we're saying, well, if you don't have this control, then the risk isn't addressed. And it's like, well, that's not how it works. Like we're going a level below the control and saying, what's the risk? And we're addressing the risk in some other way. So there was a lot of like things that we would do non-standard that we'd have to educate on. But to your question about like involving stakeholders in some of the creation of, if I understood the question correctly, like involving internal stakeholders in the creation of controls.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So change control would be the best example of that. So when we started through the process to get our first SOC 2, we really that was basically my very first thing when I joined the company. I joined in mid-August, and we basically within a couple of weeks we basically said, okay, by the end of the year we're going to have a SOC 2 type 1. I'm like, all right, so that's aggressive. And so we got to work on it, and thankfully, because the previous GRC team had already established ISO 27001, 27002, we had we had a baseline of controls, and so there were some things that were already established. But going from ISO to SOC 2, and then especially thinking forward to a SOC 2 Type 2 there's a lot more rigor there. And so one of the things that initially jumped out at us was, okay, the change control process was good enough to have passed an ISO audit. It's not good enough to pass a SOC 2 Type 2 in any way. We need a lot more formalization here. And we knew that that was going to create some headaches among engineers because it was going to add friction to the development process. And Segment was, at the time, was still very, very of the startup mindset. It was, we need to move quickly. We don't need to be putting up barriers to shipping. Like, we got to ship, iterate. Like, let's go. And so knowing that that was going to slow that down, we needed to make some decisions about how we how we design this control. And we did it in a way that addressed what we needed to from a SOC 2 standpoint, but then it also it would not hinder engineering as much as we were afraid that it might. And so we sat down with some engineering managers, some of the eng directors, and said, "Look, guys, this is the situation we're in. SOC 2 is an enterprise level goal now. Like, the E team has said we need to do this because it's coming up a lot more in sales conversations. Like, the fact that we don't have this is causing us to lose sales." And so that was really the impetus that the E team needed to say, okay, well, we need to go get this thing. And so knowing that, okay, everyone was aligned that we need to get SOC 2, it's like, okay, here's this gap and here's the thing that we're trying to accomplish. How do we do this in the best way possible? And of course, we could have come in as the GRC team and said, well, here's what we're going to do because this is what we think is best, and we need to implement this, and this. But instead, we basically posed the problem to our engineering directors and managers and said, here's the core issue we're trying to solve. How would you go about solving this? And what's the best way in the least amount of friction? What's the best way to do this? And then we had them design the controls and basically put the processes in place. Sorry, there's a massive tree that just went down across the street. It's been leaning all day long, and it just blew over onto a duplex.
So clearly we were dealing with a lot of distractions this day due to the weather, but don't worry, we're going to make the episode work, and the show notes, they're going to be chef's kiss. You're going to want to check those out at the end of this. So getting right back into the interview here, Dustin did a fantastic job of remembering where he left off and continuing his thought.
We might seriously have to re-record this entire episode so that you've got actually,
or it's going to be a really good episode.
Okay. Anyway, so our key here was for change control was having the stakeholders who were actually going to have to do the control, design it and implement it. Of course, with our oversight, right? Like, we weren't just saying, okay, go do this and whatever you do is fine. Like, it was very much a partnership, but it was them. Like, we said, here are the core baseline things that we need to be able to show in an audit. How would you go about doing that?
And then, out of curiosity, don't mean to interrupt your thought process there, but just telling engineers, hey, we need to do this for an audit. That's not really a great way. I feel like that really fosters that buy-in. Did you have any kind of other communication that you gave them to really get them to take ownership of developing this?
Yeah. So that was where it was important for us to have the SOC 2 was the driver of all of this. And it, by this point, had been established as an enterprise, business level objective. So the company had, we had looked, we were starting to lose some sales because very security conscious customers. I mean, it was the SOC 2 report was table stakes for them. And when our sales folks said, when they asked, hey, can we have your SOC 2 report? And said, well, we don't have one. We don't really have a timeline for when we're going to have one. They're like, we can't do business with you. And so when you start losing sales, that starts getting the attention of the higher ups. And so at that point, we decided kind of in the fall of 2019, the E team said, hey, we've got to do this. We're losing sales. We need SOC 2. And so that was really the high level alignment that was needed for us to move forward. And so it wasn't us going in saying this thing has to be done. The whole company was agreed that SOC 2 is important to the future of this company. We want to continue to grow, scale, really increase our sales. And so this is the thing that has to happen. So there was kind of everyone in the company, it had been talked about at company all hands, at engineering all hands. So when we came around talking about SOC 2, everybody already knew what it was. I had been in front of, okay, I don't think I was in front of the whole company, but I had been in front of all of engineering talking about it, saying, hey, you're going to hear a lot more about this. This is what it is. This is what it means. This is why it's important. This is why the E team has decided that this is an important objective. So we weren't coming in cold to these conversations. They already knew, like everyone's sitting down, and especially we weren't talking at this point to ICs. It was mostly to eng managers and directors, and so they were more accommodating to, okay, yes, we understand. Like this is kind of it's going to add some friction to our process, but hey, we've got to do it. So that was that kind of. There was all of that context that existed by the time we sat down to actually have that conversation, and which made it like, again, we weren't coming in saying you have to do this because we in the GRC team say it's important and you've got to do it. Like there's no way that would have in Segment's culture, if we had done that, they just would have been like, we got too much to do, like go away. so I think having that enterprise buy-in was, I mean, it was critical because, like I said, it was the context, it was the air that surrounded all of these conversations. Like everyone knew that this was a important thing, and so we needed to work to do it. And to be quite honest with you, we had some IC engineers who ended up leaving the company because like change control was kind of the thing that pushed them over the edge. They're like, if I'm gonna have to deal with this, I don't want to work here. And they were more suited to very early stage, move fast. They don't want to have to deal with a lot. And I get that mentality. And so it kind of naturally forced some folks who they're like, if we've grown for having to do this change control stuff, we've grown too big for me. I'm ready to move on. And so some people left actually because they just didn't want to deal with it, and nothing wrong with that at all. So I think that conversation was eye opening for me in how, and then watching some other folks who like were truly like, they proposed a solution and proposed using tools and things that like we didn't know that existed, and using some like functionality in GitHub to do some things. And I'm like, I didn't even know that was an option. And then, we had the benefit of being a very engineering first organization. And so they're like, well, this sort of functionality here doesn't necessarily exist today, but we can build a tool to help with this. And Segment at the time had a very good, I don't know if they still do, but had a very good tooling team that was focused on developing tooling specifically for engineering to help move faster, to deploy faster, to automate a lot of things. And so they said, yeah, we can build some of this stuff. We can build it into the processes. We can build some reporting. And so there was the engineering culture helped there too, that for some things that we kind of came up with a bespoke solution or a bespoke idea for how to implement this within Segment's environment. And then we weren't having to say, well, we've got to use this tool to do it. It was like, well, we kind of need this process. We know this tool can do one part of it. We can build another part of it, and we can kind of string everything together to meet the core requirements, which end of the day is all I care about. Like, as long as I've got, for me to have to sit in front of the auditor and explain all this, as long as we've got the story and the documentation will line up with the story, that's all I need. It doesn't matter that it doesn't look like what a lot of other organizations would have done.
I was going to say, speaking of not looking like what other organizations are doing, when I came in, when you were describing it, I could have had the similar approach of like, I'm not used to whatever we're doing here. How is the process of socializing that with people coming from that kind of traditional GRC space where the only solution that they have in mind is we're going to put a bottleneck right here, and that's going to stop everything. It's going to basically bring things to a halt. Like, how is getting people to kind of wrap their heads around that?
Yeah, it wasn't so much internally. I think more of those conversations happened with customers usually when they're like, okay, well, tell me about your sales process and talk about your change advisory board, and how often who's responsible for approving changes and all this stuff. And it's like, well, our developers can actually implement changes themselves. And I learned very early on to not like to tackle that directly head on and say, well, hey, look, here's our process. We're small, nimble company. Our engineers deploy their own changes. However, we have systems in place that are designed that if they were to do that and there wasn't approval by someone else, it's going to get flagged to a whole bunch of people. And so, yes, like it technically can happen. They could do it without someone, but if they don't follow our established processes, they're going to get flagged for it. And then we've got some follow-up processes to kind of add a little bit of level of shame. You don't want to end up on the report that shows that you had a lot of change control violations and you weren't going back and fixing them. So I learned, as far as communicating it, to not like shy away from that fact, but to tackle it head on and say, this is how we do it. This is why we do it. And what you really care about is not that we have a change advisory board, but that like someone's just not putting stuff into production without anybody else seeing it. Like that's ultimately the objective of change control, right? Like, you don't want one, that's the Office Space scenario. You don't want one person deploying changes and then they're, siphoning off fractions of a cent or something. So like as long as we could prove that that wasn't happening, or that if it did happen, it would be flagged and then followed up on, everybody was fine. And it would take some more conversation with some customers than others to kind of get them comfortable with that. But at the end of the day, so many things that, not just change control, but where if we didn't do it the way that the GRC textbook says it's supposed to be done, the conversation revolved around, okay, let's pull back from the control. What's the risk we're trying to address? And then I would get alignment on, are we all agreed? Like, this is the core, like, regardless of the control, this is the core risk you're asking about. Okay, we're in agreement. Yes, here's how we address that risk. And so being able to take that approach to it, I enjoyed it, to be quite honest with you. Like, I enjoyed being able to show how we did things, because I think we did things very, very well. And the fact that we did things well, we had a really good security culture. That just made my job, to have either talking to auditors or customers, it made my job a lot easier, because I could talk about things. Like, it wasn't like I was trying to hide stuff. It's just I would have to explain it, get folks used to, this is not going to look like what you expect it to look like. It's going to look like this, but we're still addressing the core risk.
Now, out of curiosity, because I think that was one of the things that, again, there's just a lot that Segment did that I wasn't quite used to doing, like the traditional GRC space, and kind of seeing almost a part of your role was to cheerlead for the organization. Do you think, like, the team knowing that you were out there basically telling customers, hey, like, we are excelling at the things that we're doing when it comes to security, and that's one of the reasons why you should use us? Do you think that kind of built rapport with the people you were working with?
I like to think so. Yeah. I mean, I think people could, I had a genuine enthusiasm to jump on customer calls and talk about this stuff. And I think that kind of, like, that would come through. I tried to be transparent. There's a balance between, you don't want to air all your dirty laundry, but you also want to be, transparent and build trust. And I think we would do that. I think we were able to strike a very good balance at saying, here's maybe a thing that we don't do well, and be very upfront about that. But here's the steps we're taking to address it. Like, it's shown up on the risk assessment. We know it's a thing. We know it's an area that we need to work on. It's on the security goals for this quarter. So being upfront about some of that stuff, even if it wasn't like exactly what the customer was working for, simply because we showed that we cared, we had a plan, like we recognized it. We weren't just trying to sweep it under the rug. That built a lot of trust, and it would show that we had, even though we were a very small security team, that we were taking care of the things that actually need to be taken care of.
Yeah, now definitely we've covered a whole bunch of different projects that you've worked on, and all the stuff that you're able to accomplish. I want to focus a little bit on the size of the team. Like, you just described a whole bunch of different stuff that your team was able to do. You were one of a 2-person team. Can you kind of describe what are some of the things that you put in place to allow your team to scale as the business grew? Because I think you and I have both seen like larger companies where you have entire groups of GRC people. They're all split out in their pillars. But at the same time, you and the other resource you were working with, you were able to do all of those things that those other teams are doing, but in an efficient enough way where you didn't need to scale at the same rate as the business, in terms of people, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Automation was huge. Making use of written documents and things like that. I mean, that was something that we realized very, very early on was a constraint. Actually, to kind of tell a little bit of a backstory on that, when Steve, who was our director of GRC, when he joined, the previous director of GRC had been exited, and there was one person left or actually there were 2 people on the team at that time. And so he had a team of 2, and within about 2 weeks of him joining, both of them left. And so for a period of time, until about a month and a half until I joined, he was a one-man GRC show running everything. And so, I was able to help.
Stomach hurt to think about.
Yeah. I mean, and all the stuff I know that he was doing. And of course, being new to the role, new to the company, like still trying to like learn everything while
the Segment's not a simple product.
No, it's not. And then having to have those customer conversations. And then, no joke, my second week of work was our ISO surveillance audit that year, or was a surveillance audit. And so and I sat in the meetings and everything, and it was like, okay, but that was very good for me, because I got to hear, and I got to hear folks talk about the product and the controls and some of the things that were already in place. And I got to meet a lot of our stakeholders. So it ended up being a very good introduction to the company for me. But at the same time, there was way more work than we had people to do it. And so I think it was a combination of us, for one, being reasonable about what we could do. And we had a lot of support from executives around that. And we were able to kind of establish a revenue cutoff and say, look, if you're a customer coming in, you're paying us, $25,000 a year. That's relatively small for us. You're asking for an audit every year. We can't do that. Like we just don't have the team to do it. And so the fact that we were able to sort of take that stance and be able to draw some lines and say, look, if you don't meet these thresholds, like we will support you, but only so much. And we wish we could support everyone exactly the same and be able to roll out the red carpet for everybody that wanted to come in and see it, but we simply don't have the resources for it. And most folks were understanding of that. And it also helped that when push came to shove in a lot of conversations, we had executive backing for that. They would go to bat for us, and it wasn't just something that, well, it's for a customer, so we got to do it. No, they would say, look, we can't support everybody equally. And so being able to have that was one way of kind of regulating the amount of work that we had. So we weren't just completely inundated with every single thing that came in. We tried to have I think we did have a very good self-service security page. The segment.com/security was very robust, gave a lot of information. We had a white paper that detailed more things, and that was able to answer a lot of questions. And so having that sort of self-service portion that for some very basic security questions, we could point customers to. And then we even trained the sales or go-to-market team. We trained them, hey, go, like when someone's asking about this, point them here first. And so that was like, we would have some of these resources that were publicly available. And then the second step was to not have sales asking, like just forwarding every single security request to us. We equipped sales to be able to answer a lot of those questions. And that was through a variety of processes. We would have some wiki pages from just kind of a Slack channel that we shared where we would say, hey, if they ask about this, say this. Then we also had a tool that had a lot of the common security questions and we had written the answers for them. And so that helped for sales. If there was one-off questions or if they got a questionnaire, they could take the first pass at it. It didn't even make it to us because we knew all the common questions that were asked. There's a lot of the common third-party vendor questionnaire frameworks we could go through and provide the standard answers for that. And for most customers, that was sufficient. But then we weren't doing the work. Sales was empowered to be able to answer all of those questions without forwarding to us. And so then finally, so a lot of the stuff that we would end up working on, in addition to just maintaining those resources, we would end up on the very complicated, high value, high touch, the ones that really needed the white glove hand holding experience. Those customers, those were the ones where we ended up spending most of our time working with. So if they had some either really complicated technical questions, we would end up answering those. Or if they were just, again, the very, top dollar customers who we wanted to make sure had the highest level of care, we would handle those personally. So it was sort of that like layered stack of making sure that like we had the ability to answer the common questions. Like it was kind of like the 80-20 rule, right? Like 80% of the questions customers would ask, like we knew could be answered by standardized resources. And then we empowered others to provide those answers. And then that last 20% was where our real value add was getting on the phone, walking through things, making sure that there was a deep level of understanding from the customer and that they had all of their concerns addressed. So it was really that like tiered framework is how we approached it and how we were able to continue to scale. I think our sales, I think by the time you joined the team, our sales team was probably double what it was by the time I joined. And yet we were still supporting effectively, we were using the same processes to support the customer. So we had way more. And again, it's that 80-20 rule. 80% of those requests were able to be either the self-serve or the things that go to market could answer. So long-winded way of answering that question, but we provided. It wasn't just us saying we're going to handle everything. Like we provided resources to allow others to handle it, and in most instances, that was sufficient.
Now you just basically went through a whole bunch of different teams that you were working with, and even some of the previous answers. Like there's definitely a collaboration between GRC and the other stakeholders, which I think that's the way it should be. In all of those different things that you're doing and working with those different teams and those different resources, is there anybody in particular that stood out to you, or a process or a project that somebody was working on that reduced risk for the company that you think needs to be highlighted?
Wow. We had some, especially going through the SOC 2, we had some real champions in HR who I partnered with. They had never dealt with kind of the level of audit requests that were being asked for that we needed for the SOC 2, especially the SOC 2 Type 2. And again, because it was an enterprise objective, and we had built some good relationships there. So they knew it was important. Plus, we made sure that we had good working relationships with them for other questions, and so they were willing to help us and do what was needed. HR was always a huge champion because employee lists and background checks and training and things like that, they end up having to supply a lot of data because almost all of that ends up being in a type 2. It's a sample-based control. So you're looking at maybe 25 pieces of evidence for each one of those controls. So the HR always ends up having a pretty heavy load. And we had some really, really awesome folks who would always help us out and would, we made sure they knew ahead of time, hey, the audit's going to be happening then. Here's when we're going to have some requests. If you can, just make some time for us here. And they were always happy to do it. And that was that made my life easier because I wasn't spending a ton of time trying to track down these HR requests that were relatively simple, but you always in these audits always seem to be the things that you have issues tracking down, either because they don't provide the right screenshots or something like that. And so that we did maybe some more hand holding with them initially, just to I would sit on a Zoom and say, hey, when you're pulling this is what we need. So I made sure right off the bat, we weren't going to have to go back and ask for stuff twice, because that's frustrating for every party. So I would take time on the front end to make sure they knew, and then they were the rock stars that they were and got us everything that we needed first time.
Now, in all the things that we've discussed today, is there maybe like a top 3 things that when GRC resources go back to work on Monday, they really need to be thinking about, like, what can I implement today to make my GRC program more efficient or more effective, or just even just building that better relationship with the stakeholders?
Yeah, the stakeholder relationships are huge. I keep coming back, and I've thought about this a lot since I've left Twilio. Was just being able to communicate the value of the program and the value of the specific roles within GRC in terms of the business. And I know we talked about this earlier. That to me is one of the biggest differentiators between folks who end up being successful and they get the resources that they need, and there's just a very collaborative feel, versus those who then end up frustrated because, well, no one wants to. I've asked for this person to review this policy 5 times and they just won't make the time for it. If you can't quantify why that's an important thing to do, then why should someone else do it? Like, why is it beneficial for them? And as I've gotten more exposed to being in kind of a sales role ish in my current venture, and have taken some sales training. I've got one of my mentors in that space. He opens up he runs a sales seminar every year. Opens it up. First line is, "It's never ever 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 about you. It's always about the other person." And I think that applies not just in sales, but it applies in GRC situations, especially when you're working with other stakeholders. Like, it's not about what you want to get done. Like, you've got to make sure that the other person understands why this thing is important and why it matters to them, not to you. No one cares that you've got some objective that needs to get done, or that there's this risk assessment that's out there. If you don't put it in terms of why it matters to the other person, they're not going to give the time of day to it. You're going to end up running around trying to get it done. And maybe at the very end, because you have to go to their manager, they make them do it. And that just tears relationships down. So the more that you can put things into why something is important to other people, the more successful you are in basically anything. That's sales 101. So I would highly encourage folks to not get focused in this view of what I'm doing is so important, therefore everyone else must recognize its importance and must do what I say, because that's what the GRC textbook said to do, and they need to understand it, so they've got to go do it. No, they need to understand why it's important to them. And so often in a business context, if you can put that in how this thing relates to moving the business forward, everyone's like, okay, well, I get that. Yes, if you're at a startup, I want my stock options to become worth something. So yes, I get why this is a thing we need to be doing.
After Dustin gave that GRC pro tip, I took a look at the time, and trying to be cognizant of the length of these episodes, I was like, all right, we need to wrap this up. But in doing so, I almost unceremoniously ended the episode without giving Dustin the opportunity to tell us what he's currently working on, or how you all will be able to connect with Dustin if you have any questions about GRC in the future. So let's give Dustin a proper GRC podcast closing. So obviously throughout the show, we've alluded to the fact that you're no longer in the GRC space, but you are still using GRC principles, I'm assuming, as you transitioned into your new role. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit, what are you working on now? And is there any kind of tie-in that you've noticed between what you used to do and what you currently do, or principles that you might take going forward?
Yeah. So while I was working in security and GRC, I had started investing in real estate on the side. And so that kind of grew into more of a thing I realized I really, really enjoyed. And so the timing was right back in July of last year, July of 22, for me to leave Twilio and focus full time on building a real estate investing company. So I run Big Spring Capital. You can check us out at bigspringcap.com. Big Spring, singular, not springs. But we focus on mainly commercial real estate. So had a strong initial focus in apartment buildings, but mainly things that will cash flow. And so we do the syndication model. And so it's basically I partner with some other folks to find deals. And then we partner with investors who are looking to invest in those deals. So we get a group of investors. Everybody comes together to invest in that deal. And then we all share in the cash flow and the profit at sale. Apartments is kind of where that started. Working on a few different things now, but all sort of that same. They're either directly real estate or real estate adjacent. So maybe some things around debt and mortgages. But I try to give my investors cash flow. That's my primary objective, is looking for things that cash flow. I think it's very important to have passive cash flow. It's one of the quickest ways to exit the rat race. Exit the rat race. I say that clearly there. The more passive cash flow you've got, the more options you have. Even if you love your job, you never know. We're going through a bit of a tumultuous environment right now. People getting laid off. So even if you love what you do, that could come to an end, or a situation could change, like happened with me at McKesson, where we had wonderful environment and then leadership changed, and then it became very, very terrible and not a place that I wanted to be. So I always recommend for folks to kind of build that optionality. Even if you want to keep working your job, it's still great to be able to know that if you needed to leave or had to leave, had a health issue, something like that, there's something there. So that's what I hope people do that through real estate. I think it's one of the best vehicles for wealth building and wealth creation that's ever existed. And we've got a fantastic opportunity to do it here in the US. And so run that business. And yeah, that's as far as like, I guess the second part is, how GRC topics related to that. Certainly a lot of risk management when in my role, we're investing with, other people's money. I want to treat that way better than I treat my own money. And so it's a lot of the same things we talked about earlier, using especially risk management frameworks and saying, okay, we have a deal. What could go wrong? What's the likelihood of that thing going wrong? What's the impact if it does go wrong? And that leads to different investment decisions. There might be things that we perceive to be riskier, and the return's not there, and so it's not something I want to bring to my investors if I feel like it's not going to protect their capital first and foremost, and then provide cash flow second. So if there's it's really going through again that same like risk ranking framework and saying what could happen here, and let's make sure that we're doing everything we can to mitigate that to a reasonable level, or if we've mitigated it, but we're going to acknowledge this is a riskier investment, but the return's higher. And so everyone kind of goes into it, eyes wide open, knowing exactly what they're getting into. But that's far and away the most common application of especially risk management in deals that I look at and the things that I'm doing now.
And I think even on the flip side, as we kind of mentioned, GRC controls that don't look like, quote unquote, like what you would expect. I think some of the things that we've talked about, like hedging, like just because you have a great like 9 to 5, you work in tech, like we're going through one of those tumultuous periods where it's like, I have to admit, part of me was just like, nah, this will always be great. Like the cash will always be awesome. Like the RSUs are going to be like flowing in. And it's like, nope. All that can end at a certain point, and being able to have those alternative opportunities kind of create that growth and look out for your family. I think it was one of the first major things where I was like, I might need to take a different look at investments.
For sure. And that's something that a lot of folks, especially if you've been in tech for the last decade, you've never seen an environment like this. Like this is completely new. And I think a lot of folks, if that's what you came into and it's all you've known for the last 10 years, you just thought everything was going to be, continually up and to the right, and was that this is just how things go, but it's not. I think a lot of folks are, I like to say often that job security is a myth. I really don't believe in something in job security. I think it's not there. And folks who say that they do, or say that they have security, I think are just fooling themselves. If you're working for someone else and this other entity controls whether or not you are employed and you continue to receive a paycheck, you don't have job security. And again, that's been a little bit of a tough argument in the last 10 years when there's been money flowing around everywhere and you had cheap debt and everyone's growing and hiring and all of that. And I think we've started to see in the last year that it's not always that way. And so you have to be prepared. Even folks who are in roles that with very strong, bluest of the blue chip tech companies that thought that, there would never be layoffs are now experiencing round after round of them. And it's a tough spot to be in. It's a tough thing to realize, but if you do the right things and sort of set up ahead of time, you can protect against that. Even if you don't want to leave and go do something completely different, like me, to transition to real estate, even just setting up those separate cash flow streams can provide that buffer to either give you optionality and ride some things out, or again, if whatever environment, health changes. That's another one that I like to talk about. You never know when something might happen with your own health, and especially for folks who end up doing their own thing and they end up in this sort of solopreneur kind of mindset. They don't realize that if something happened to them, then their income's gone. And so having uncorrelated things that owning assets they're going to pay you regardless of whether you do work or not is just the best. It's the best security you can have, because it doesn't matter. You get sick, you decide you want to go to the beach for a month. It doesn't matter. The money's going to keep coming in. It's the best place to invest.
So obviously you've made an impact on me in terms of the GRC principles personally and professionally. So if other people wanted to get in contact with you just for questions, comments, either about GRC or getting the additional cash flows for personal governance, risk, and compliance management, if you will, how can people get in contact with you?
Yeah, easiest way would be Twitter. I'm pretty active there. My handle is the Dustin Bailey. So you can find me there. And I think I mentioned there, I've got links on my Twitter to kind of everywhere else that I am. If got a link to a Calendly, if anybody wants to set up a call and talk about investing, talk about GRC things, I'd still be happy to kind of share some experience things that I did there. If folks are looking for that. So Twitter is the best place. The Dustin Bailey, and we can connect. Follow me there. Connect on something. I've got links to my LinkedIn and my website and everything there.
And all this information is going to be on the grcpodcast.com in the show notes. So that's how our listeners will be able to find this. So Dustin, thank you for coming back to the GRC space and having this conversation with me and sharing all the knowledge and your growth throughout your career.
Absolutely, Mark. Appreciate you having me.